The boardroom air felt thick and stale, smelling of artificial leather and too much floor wax. Outside, a steady autumn drizzle blurred the city skyline. I sat at one end of the long mahogany table, my hands clasped together, watching Catherine Thorne slide a thin folder across the polished surface. She did not look at me. Her eyes remained fixed on her tablet screen, her manicured nails tapping a rhythmic beat against the glass. The words she spoke were flat, practiced, and completely devoid of warmth. She told me that the director had convinced her that my role was no longer essential to the company. She said they were restructuring the entire department and that my services would no longer be required. I felt a cold sensation settle in my stomach. 22 years. I had given 22 years of my life to this place. I had started when we were just a tiny startup, writing the initial code for an infrastructure that now supported millions of transactions. I built the foundations, the servers, the security protocols, and the custom database systems from the ground up. Now, my entire career here was being compressed into a 60-minute exit window. At the other end of the room, Julian Bradley leaned against the wall. His arms were crossed over his chest, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Julian was the technology director who had been brought in 4 years ago. From the very beginning, he had viewed me as a threat. He was obsessed with corporate buzzwords and flashy slides, but his technical understanding was shallow. He could not comprehend the complex biomimetic design of our infrastructure. To his fragile ego, my deep understanding of the system was a threat that had to be removed. Catherine finally looked up, her eyebrows arched in a silent question. She was clearly annoyed that I had not reacted with anger. She asked if I had any questions before they escorted me out. I kept my voice steady. I told her I had only one question. I asked who would be managing the adaptive cycling protocol once I was gone. Julian stepped forward, his leather shoes squeaking on the hardwood. He spoke with absolute crushing arrogance, claiming that they were implementing an always-on architecture starting tonight. He told me my cycling protocol was inefficient and outdated. He said modern systems did not need rest periods and that they were moving away from my pet theories. I simply nodded. I knew exactly what was going to happen, but I chose not to argue. I had designed our server infrastructure using biomimetic principles, mimicking natural biological patterns where systems required periods of reduced load to self-clean and recover. Because of this cycling protocol, our servers use 30% less energy and experience 50% fewer hardware failures than the industry standard. But Julian was too blind to see the data. Catherine waved her hand, dismissing the topic. She told me that security would meet me at my cubicle to oversee my departure. As I stood up and smoothed my jacket, Julian leaned in and whispered that I should have retired years ago. I did not reply. I walked out of the boardroom with my head held high. I packed my life into a single box under the watchful eye of a security guard who refused to meet my eyes. I packed my coffee mug, my desk plant, and the framed photo of my son Ryan. I did not touch the company files. I deleted nothing from the servers. I changed no administrative passwords and I altered no settings. I had documented every single protocol in the official manuals. I simply gathered my things and drove home. When I got to my house, I took off my tie, opened a bottle of rye whiskey, and poured myself a drink. I sat on my back porch, listening to the rain and watching the clock on the wall. I knew that the automated cycling protocol was scheduled to initiate at midnight. The system would begin shifting data loads to different server clusters, allowing others to enter low power states to cool down. If Julian had disabled that protocol, the servers would continue running at full capacity under heavy night processing loads. My phone began to ring at 4:17 in the morning. I looked at the screen, saw the company name, and laid it back down on the nightstand. Over the next hour, my phone vibrated constantly. 8 missed calls and 18 text messages piled up, each message growing increasingly frantic. The database was locked. The customer transactions were failing. The main servers were overheating. At 5:40 in the morning, Julian called from his personal number. I answered the phone, keeping my voice quiet and calm. He did not even say hello. He just hissed into the receiver, asking what I had done to the system. I took a slow sip of my coffee and told him I had done absolutely nothing. I explained that was the exact problem. I had left the system working perfectly, but he had overridden the safety protocols. He threatened to sue me into oblivion if I did not fix it immediately. I told him he had no grounds to sue. I had designed a system that worked flawlessly until he decided to break it. I suggested he check the maintenance logs and thermodynamic reports, which were all fully documented. He just slammed the phone down. I smiled, poured another cup of coffee, and waited for the next call. It did not take long for the phone to ring again. At 6:15 in the morning, Catherine Thorne herself called. The cold, efficient tone she had used in the boardroom was completely gone, replaced by a tense, barely controlled panic. She did not demand, she pleaded. She told me the company was losing hundreds of thousands of dollars every hour the system was down. She asked me to name my price to come back and resolve the issue. I sat back in my armchair, feeling a sense of quiet vindication. I told her that I would return as an independent consultant, but my fee would be 25% of whatever the total outage cost the company, paid up front. She gasped, calling it extortion. I replied that it was simply the market rate for emergency recovery services. I told her she was free to hire someone else, but she would have to explain the delay to the board. I knew they could not find anyone else in time. After a long, heavy silence, she agreed and said she would have the contract sent to my email within 10 minutes. While I waited for the paperwork, I looked at the framed photograph of my son Ryan on the shelf. I am Daniel Vance. At 55 years old, I had spent the better part of my life building a career in an industry that constantly tried to push older engineers aside. I was divorced, and my primary focus was ensuring my son had the resources he needed to finish his university degree. I had climbed the ranks of the technology sector by focusing on efficiency and sustainability long before those words became corporate trends. I believed that technology should work in harmony with natural laws, not against them. I had spent countless nights studying biological systems, looking at how forests distribute nutrients and how human muscles recover from exertion. I applied those exact principles to computing, creating a system that was not just powerful, but resilient and sustainable. My journey had started 22 years ago, when the company was just a struggling startup operating out of a small, cold warehouse. The founder, Gerald, had been a visionary leader who valued practical solutions over corporate theater. He had seen my biomimetic designs and told me that thinking differently was exactly what the company needed to survive. Under his guidance, I had built the entire infrastructure. But when Gerald sold the business 4 years ago, the new owners brought in Julian Bradley. Julian was a traditionalist who believed that servers were like shovels, tools that should be worked continuously until they broke. We fought constantly in meetings. He would argue that servers did not need rest, and I would point to the data showing our system had 50% fewer failures and 3% lower energy costs than our competitors. Actually, our energy savings were closer to 30%, but Julian never paid attention to the detailed spreadsheets I prepared. He never listened. 9 months ago, Catherine was hired as the new chief executive officer. She was young, ambitious, and obsessed with short-term growth metrics. Julian quickly aligned himself with her, presenting glossy slides that promised massive expansion without the need for my complex maintenance routines. They sidelined me, ignored my reports, and finally decided to replace me, believing they could run my system without me. Once the consulting contract was signed and the initial deposit cleared my bank account, I got into my car and drove back to the office. I did not rush. I drove at the speed limit, enjoying the quiet morning rain. I arrived at the building around 8 in the morning. When I entered the server room, it was absolute chaos. Yellow warning lights were flashing across the racks, and a loud, piercing alarm was blaring from the main diagnostic console. Junior technicians were running around with pale faces, looking completely lost, while Julian stood in the center of the room, shouting orders that made no technical sense. The air in the room was hot and thick, smelling of hot plastic and ozone. The hardware was literally smoking from being pushed far beyond its physical limits. I walked in, set my bag down, and checked the main console. The temperature indicators were glowing bright red. I turned to Julian and Catherine, who had just entered behind me. I told them that the system required a complete 16-hour shutdown to cool the processors and reset the database indexing. Julian stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. He shouted that a 16-hour shutdown was unacceptable and would cost millions in lost transactions. I looked at him calmly and told him that if he did not shut it down now, the heat would permanently warp the silicon boards and they would be looking at a $9 million hardware replacement bill instead. Catherine looked at Julian, then at me. Her face was pale. She ordered him to stand down and told me to do whatever was necessary. For the next 16 hours, I supervised the controlled shutdown. I used the quiet time to download the system logs, meticulously documenting the override commands that Julian had entered at midnight, the warnings the system had generated, and the alerts he had manually dismissed. I saved everything to an external drive. I was going to make sure that when the post-mortem report was written, there would be no doubt about who had pulled the trigger. The hum of the cooling fans slowly faded as the server racks went dark. The silence in the room was heavy, almost peaceful. I sat at my old workstation, watching the temperature gauges crawl down from the danger zone. Julian had left the room, unable to bear the sight of me in control. Catherine remained for a while, watching the screens with a hollow look in her eyes, before she retreated to her office to deal with the board of directors. As the hours passed, I analyzed the data logs. It was worse than I had initially thought. By running the processors at maximum capacity without the cycling protocol, the system had experienced severe thermal throttling. This throttling had caused the database write operations to desynchronize. In simple terms, the system had kept processing transactions, but it had stopped verifying the data integrity. The transaction logs were full of orphaned records and half-written data packets. When the 16-hour cooling period finally ended, I began the gradual power-up sequence, bringing the server clusters online one by one. But as the database came back, my console flagged thousands of corrupted index files. Just then, Catherine walked in, her phone pressed to her ear. She hung up and looked at me, her voice shaking. She said they were receiving hundreds of customer complaints. Transactions from the last week were showing errors, and some accounts were missing data entirely. She accused me of causing the corruption. I sat back, took a sip of my coffee, and shook my head. I told her that this was the exact cascade effect I had warned about in my quarterly report 9 months ago. I explained that when the system is forced to run continuously without the recovery cycles, it skips data integrity checkpoints to keep up with the volume. The corruption was the direct result of Julian's override, not my recovery. I showed her the time-stamped logs where the write errors began. Hours before I was even fired, Julian walked in just in time to hear my explanation. He slammed his hand on the desk, accusing me of designing a fragile system that was built to fail if I was not there to manage it. I told him my system had operated flawlessly for 10 years before he arrived. I said the only thing fragile about the system was his understanding of it. I told him that any competent engineer would have recognized the warning signs, but he had ignored them because of his own arrogance. Julian turned to Catherine and demanded they bring in an external recovery team from a major technology firm. I interrupted him immediately. I told Catherine she could hire whoever she wanted, but an external team would take twice as long to understand the custom biomimetic architecture and would likely recover only half the data. I told her my system was unique, and only its architect could untangle this mess. I explained that my proprietary indexing system used customized data structures that standard database recovery tools would simply destroy. Before she could answer, her phone rang again. She looked at the caller ID, her eyes widening. It was the director of their largest client, Gibson. She put the call on speaker. The man's voice was loud and furious, echoing in the quiet room. He shouted that their entire logistics network was paralyzed, and they were facing millions of dollars in shipping delays. He demanded to know when the system would be online. Catherine looked at me with desperation. I wrote a note on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. I can restore Gibson's database first. 6 hours. Catherine quickly spoke into the phone, promising the client that their system would be fully operational within 6 hours. Once she hung up, she turned to me and told me to get to work. I smiled politely and told her that because database recovery was far more complex than a simple system restart, my consulting fee was now 35% of the total outage cost. Julian exploded, calling me a thief. I told him he was welcome to fix it himself. Catherine cut him off, telling me to just do the work and she would sign the addendum. I spent the next 6 hours rebuilt the indexing structure for Gibson's database. I worked without a break, my fingers flying across the keyboard, writing scripts to parse the corrupted data packets and reassemble the transaction logs. By 6 in the evening, Gibson's systems came back online, and their logistics network began to move again. The rest of the company's databases, however, remained offline. As midnight approached, I was still working in the server room. The door opened, and Julian slipped in. He stood behind me, his voice low and threatening. He told me he knew what I was doing. He accused me of playing the hero after sabotaging the company. I did not look up from my screen. I told him that accusing me of sabotage was a serious mistake, especially since I had documented the failure in 15 different reports that he had ignored. Julian leaned down, his face close to mine. He claimed he had found an external login signature showing I had accessed the network remotely the night I was fired. My heart beat a little faster, but I kept my face blank. I turned to him and explained that the signature was my automated monitoring ping, which had checked the server health daily for 10 years. It was fully documented in the system specifications. Julian sneered, telling me that when this crisis was over, he would make sure I was blacklisted from the entire industry. I looked him in the eye and told him that threatening the only person who could save his job was a bold but foolish strategy. I told him to leave the room so I could focus on saving what was left of the company. The next morning, I presented Catherine with a detailed 7-day recovery timeline to restore the remaining databases. She looked exhausted, her hair messy and dark circles under her eyes. She told me the board of directors was meeting that afternoon and they wanted answers. A few hours later, I was summoned to the boardroom. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. 14 board members sat around the long table with Catherine and Julian at one end and Walter Howard, the board chairman, at the head. I was directed to sit at the far end, physically isolated from everyone else. Walter Howard spoke first, asking me why the infrastructure I had designed had failed so catastrophically. I stood up, opened my laptop, and projected the data on the screen. I told the board that my system had operated for 10 years with zero unplanned downtime. I explained that the failure was caused when Julian overridden the biomimetic cycling protocols, ignoring 15 separate written warnings. I showed them the exact charts representing the temperature spikes and the subsequent database write failures. Julian stood up, interrupting me. He argued that the cycling protocol was obsolete and that every major competitor used always-on systems. I countered immediately, showing them the financial reports. I explained that our competitors spent double the amount on hardware replacement and had twice the energy costs. I argued that my system was built for long-term sustainability and efficiency, not short-term metrics. Walter Howard leaned forward, looking intrigued by the numbers. He asked Julian what it would cost to implement his proposed always-on system properly. Julian answered confidently, saying it would cost $9 million for hardware upgrades and an additional $3 million annually in operating costs. Walter then asked what it would cost to restore my cycling protocol. I replied that it would cost $0, as the existing hardware was already designed for it. The board members began whispering among themselves. Walter Howard asked me to step out of the room while they deliberated. I spent 30 minutes pacing the quiet hallway, running calculations in my head. During those 30 minutes, I thought about the 22 years I had dedicated to this place and how easily they had tried to toss me aside. I thought about my son Ryan, who was working hard at university. This consulting fee and the potential new contract would ensure he had no student debt and that my family's financial security would be guaranteed for years to come. I knew I had them cornered, and I felt no guilt about demanding my worth. When I was called back in, Walter Howard announced their decision. They would restore my cycling protocol for now and transition to a hybrid system over the next 8 months. They offered me a 4-month contract to oversee the transition. I told them my rate would be 4 times my previous salary, plus the emergency consulting fee already agreed upon. Walter looked at the other board members, then nodded and slid the contract toward me. Julian looked like he was about to explode, but he remained silent. Over the next 3 days, I worked constantly to bring the remaining systems back online. On the fifth day, I walked into my old office and found Julian going through my desk drawers and paper files. I asked him if he was looking for something. He jumped, startled, then claimed he was doing research for the transition plan. I told him those files were outside his technical scope. He sneered, telling me the board might be impressed with my recovery work, but they would eventually move on to his modern vision. I stepped closer and told him he was desperate to find evidence of sabotage because he knew the entire disaster landed on his shoulders. I told him he was living in a fantasy world. I warned him that looking through my personal files was a violation of security protocols and that he should leave immediately before I reported him to Walter Howard. That night, as I sat in my home office reviewing the transition contract, I noticed a page that had not been in my original employment agreement. It was an intellectual property clause. I called my attorney, Diana, and asked her to review it. Diana called me back an hour later. She confirmed my suspicions. She told me the company was trying to claim sole ownership of my entire biomimetic computing methodology, not just the specific version I had built for them. She explained that they wanted me to document the entire system during the transition, and once they had the documentation, they would terminate my contract and use my technology without paying me. She said under federal patent law, specifically Section 271, they had no right to my personal methodology, but this contract would strip me of those rights. Diana explained that by signing this, I would lose the right to implement these concepts at any other firm. I realized I was facing a corporate trap designed to steal my life's work. I smiled and told Diana that we were going to write a counter-proposal. I was going to give them terms they could not refuse, but would deeply regret accepting. I was not going to let them steal the technology that would secure my family's future. The next morning, as I waited in the lobby for my meeting with Walter Howard, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Catherine's personal email account with the subject line, "What Julian did not tell you." Attached was a PDF containing a series of email exchanges between Julian Bradley and a man named Maxwell, who was the chief technology officer of our main competitor. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read. The emails showed a conspiracy that had been active for 8 months. Julian had been feeding Maxwell detailed reports on our network vulnerabilities and client dissatisfaction. The most damning email was sent 2 days before my firing. Julian had written that once I was removed, they would disable the cycling protocol, causing a system crash within 96 hours. He wrote that when the clients panicked, Maxwell's company would step in to offer migration services and they would split the commission 60-40. They had planned to destroy my infrastructure to force clients to migrate. I quickly forwarded the email to my attorney and texted Catherine, telling her to meet me in her office immediately. When I walked in, Catherine was pacing, looking completely terrified. She told me she had found the emails while auditing Julian's account for the board. She was terrified she would be fired and sued. I looked at her and told her we were going to the boardroom together. I told her she would present the emails and I would present my contract. I told her that cooperating with me was her only chance to avoid criminal charges and salvage what was left of her career. When we entered the boardroom, Walter Howard was surprised to see Catherine with me. I took the lead, telling the board that Catherine had discovered a critical security threat. Catherine connected her laptop and projected the emails on the screen. The room erupted into angry murmurs. Walter Howard's face turned dark red as he read the messages. He immediately ordered security to escort Julian from the building and contact our legal team to file charges under the Federal Defend Trade Secrets Act, Section 1836, and breach of fiduciary duty. Julian was dragged out of the building by 2 security guards, screaming threats at me, his face pale and sweating. I then connected my own drive to the projector. I showed the board that during my recovery work, I had found security logs showing my adaptive systems had automatically blocked 5 major cyber attacks last year. These attacks had never been reported because the system had healed itself. I explained that these security features were proprietary innovations and part of my broader biomimetic computing methodology. I showed them that Julian had hidden these reports to make my system look inefficient. I then handed out my revised contract. The terms were clear and non-negotiable. First, I would retain full ownership of the biomimetic computing intellectual property, granting the company only a non-exclusive license. Second, I would be appointed Chief Innovation Officer, reporting directly to the board. Third, I would receive an 18% royalty on all system implementations. Fourth, I would receive a seat on the board of directors. One board member accused me of exploiting their crisis. I looked him in the eye and told him I was simply establishing fair value for technology that had saved their company twice. I told them they were free to refuse, but if they did, I would walk away with my intellectual property, and they would lose their infrastructure and their market advantage. After 4 hours of intense negotiation, during which Walter Howard consulted with their corporate attorneys, the board accepted my terms, realizing they had no other choice. Julian Bradley was arrested and faced federal charges. Catherine Thorne was demoted to a minor regional role, while I took my seat on the board and established a new innovation department. I hired a team of talented young engineers to expand my biomimetic systems. 8 months later, I stood on the stage at the National Technology Summit, holding the Innovation Impact Award. The applause was loud and long. In my speech, I told the audience that nature teaches us that systems must rest, adapt, and regenerate to survive. I looked out into the crowd and saw Walter Howard smiling and nodding. As I walked off the stage, my phone buzzed. It was an automated alert from my monitoring system. Our chief competitor, the company that had tried to destroy us, was currently experiencing a massive, cascading server failure across their entire network. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and smiled. Sometimes the systems we build deliver justice all on their own. I had built a career on understanding resilience, and in the end, it was the company that proved obsolete while my designs lived on. The very system they tried to take from me had protected my future and brought down the people who tried to destroy it. I walked out into the cool night air, finally at peace, knowing that my son Ryan's future was secure and my life's work was respected.